They laughed at the plates, not out of joy but disbelief. The trays were stacked like festival offerings, steaming mashed potatoes, thick slices of ham, cornbread dripping with butter, and beans so sweet they seemed like dessert. To the Japanese women lined up in the mess hall, still gaunt from weeks of military rations, it looked like excess, obscene even. One woman muttered, "How can they eat like this?" Another whispered, "They're showing off." But the cowboys, those sunburnt, soft-spoken men in sweat-stained hats, ate without irony. No taunts, no arrogance, just quiet forks scraping against tin plates, as if such abundance was ordinary. That was the first shock. The second came hours later, when one of the youngest POWs collapsed in the dirt, her body refusing to digest the richness. And instead of mocking her, a cowboy carried her in his arms like she was family. In that moment, the laughter died, and something far more dangerous took its place: doubt. If this was cruelty, it looked an awful lot like kindness. The truck doors rattled open, and the first thing that hit them wasn't a command, it was heat. Dry, wide, swallowing heat. The kind that made sweat evaporate before it reached the skin. The kind that silenced even birds. Dust curled around their ankles as they stepped down, one by one, eyes narrowed against the sun, uniforms wilted and clinging. The boots of the American guards thudded against the packed earth. These weren't soldiers in formation. They were cowboys, real ones, hats low, rifles slung over shoulders like afterthoughts. Some leaned against fence posts, chewing toothpicks. One removed his hat as the women passed, revealing a hairline burned red from long hours under the Texas sun. His face didn't carry scorn. It carried something worse: indifference. The Japanese women had been expecting barbed wire, snarling dogs, fists. Instead, they were met with silence, fences that held cattle, not prisoners, and barns that creaked in the wind like sleepy houses. One woman whispered, "Where are the soldiers?" Another, older, shook her head and kept walking. She had been on the receiving end of real violence. This felt like a dream, a strange one, but not yet a nightmare. Then the smell hit them. It snuck through the air like a thief, curling beneath the heat. Fat, salt, slow-cooked onions, something smoky, something alive. They froze mid-step, noses twitching, eyes scanning for the source. One girl clutched her stomach involuntarily. She hadn't smelled meat in weeks, maybe months. Another turned her face away sharply, as if the aroma itself were an insult. A few scoffed under their breath. "Of course," one muttered. "They feed themselves while we starve." No one knew what to say. The scent was so rich it almost felt like mockery. Clatter echoed from the mess tent up ahead, metal against tin, boots on wooden planks, the scrape of heavy chairs being dragged across floorboards. The Americans were eating, loudly, casually. One woman whispered, "They want us to see this." Another answered, "No, they just don't care if we do." That was worse somehow, the indifference, the way they didn't even glance their way. Not out of cruelty, but because they saw nothing dangerous, nothing monstrous. Just thin women in sun-bleached uniforms, squinting like strays. A cowboy passed with a tray in his hands, piled with food so high it looked absurd. A thick chunk of cornbread glistening with butter, beans in a dark sauce, a slab of beef, pink at the center. The women watched as he sat, leaned back, and took a bite with all the ceremony of someone biting into an apple. He didn't look at them, didn't perform. That made it worse. Scoffing became their only weapon. A few shook their heads. One mimicked the chewing with exaggerated mouth movements, drawing a small laugh from another. But the laughter was sharp-edged, not joy, but armor. No one dared admit the smell made their mouths water. No one wanted to be the first to ask, "Is it really for us too?" They were led past the bunkhouse, the small infirmary, and toward a shaded overhang where a cowboy stood with a clipboard. Names were written, birth, years, ranks. The man paused as one woman muttered her name in thick syllables, his pen hovering mid-air. "Say that again?" he asked, but the translator waved it off and scribbled it down herself. He shrugged and moved on. Inside the barracks, each woman found a cot with a folded blanket and a tin basin. One stared at the items like they were some kind of ruse. Another immediately touched the wool, as if checking for needles. They didn't speak. They sat. They waited. And in that waiting, the smell of food crept in again. A small group of cowboys walked by the open doorway. One of them said something and laughed. Not at them, not even about them. But the women stiffened anyway. Every sound here was too gentle to trust. Every face too calm to believe. Dinner was coming. They all felt it. The clatter of trays, the rhythm of spoons against bowls. It wasn't the sound of punishment. It was the sound of plenty. And that, somehow, was harder to bear. Because if the enemy was not starving them, then what else had they been wrong about? Long before the stew and cornbread, before the cowboys and the sunburnt Texas dust, hunger had a different meaning. In wartime Japan, hunger wasn't just accepted, it was sacred. In every schoolhouse, every barracks, every military training camp for women auxiliaries, it was drilled into them. Food was for the worthy. The more loyal you were, the less you asked for. A belly that complained was a weakness. A belly that stayed quiet was proof of national pride. Rations were distributed like sermons, thin wafers of rice, a sliver of pickled radish, miso stretched with boiled water until it resembled nothing. The women learned early not to ask for more. The ones who did were shamed, sometimes slapped, always watched. Even the emperor is hungry, they were told. Endure. Leaflets pinned to mess hall walls showed cartoons of American gluttony, grotesque figures with dripping jaws and piles of meat. By contrast, the ideal Japanese woman stood thin, upright, hollow-cheeked, her gaze firm. To eat was to surrender. To suffer was to serve. One young auxiliary remembered kneeling on a dirt floor as a superior lectured them on pride. The older woman held up a wooden rice paddle, scorched from overuse, and said, "This is our rifle. This is our honor." They had all nodded. Some cried from the weight of it, not from the words, but from the raw pit inside them that never seemed to fill. For many of the women, including the one who now lay on a cot in Texas, gripping a clean blanket, starvation had long since stopped being painful. It had become a background hum, like wind or distant thunder, always there, always moving. Their bodies adjusted. Their skin lost color. Their periods stopped. Their dreams grew sharper, louder, as if the brain were trying to feed itself with memory alone. The most vivid dreams were always of food, not meals, but smells. Rice boiling, sweet soy, broth bubbling. Dreams they dared not share aloud. But hunger was only half the story. The other half was silence, emotional hunger. In the barracks and hospitals of wartime Japan, to complain was treason, to cry was childish. They were not civilians, they were tools. Their worth was measured in obedience, not survival. If a girl fainted, she was told to stand back up and apologize. If one vomited after standing too long in the sun, she was punished for weakness. They learned not to speak. They learned not to feel. And when the emperor's voice finally came through the radio strange and high, the first time many had ever heard it, they didn't understand the words at first. They only understood the silence that followed. Officers wept. Some tore off insignia. Others simply disappeared. Then came the order: disarm, dismantle, disappear. Some auxiliaries were told to burn everything. Others were left behind. A few clung to the fantasy that the order was a trick, that the fight would resume. Most just stood, blinking, waiting for instructions that never came. That was the moment everything cracked. They were no longer soldiers, no longer anything. And when trucks arrived at the hospital compound, driven not by Japanese soldiers but by Americans, they did not resist. Not because they had accepted defeat, but because they no longer had the energy to define what defeat even was. Some of the women cried softly as they were loaded onto the flatbeds. Others sat like statues, arms wrapped around their ribs. One girl clutched a rice ball in her hand so tightly it disintegrated. The ship that carried them across the Pacific was not what they'd feared. There were no chains, no cages, just metal bunks, too clean to trust, and meals too rich to believe. But the fear didn't vanish. It hardened. Hardened into dread, into waiting, waiting for punishment that never came, waiting for cruelty to fall like a blade. They didn't yet know that the real cruelty would be kindness, that the real wound was not what the enemy would take from them, but what they would give. And so they sailed, stomachs still growling from memories more than need, toward a land whose generosity would break them open from the inside out. The mess hall was louder than they expected, not from shouting, but from the everyday sounds of people eating without fear, laughter, forks tapping metal trays, chairs scooting across wooden floors. The POWs stood at the entrance, eyes scanning the room like animals sniffing the edge of a trap. Inside, rows of cowboys and American guards sat elbow to elbow, shoveling food into their mouths with the ease of men who had never been starved by their own nation. The women stepped forward when told, slowly. Suspicion hung over them like smoke. The smell, the same rich, greasy perfume that had haunted them since arrival, was stronger now. It clung to the air. Bacon, stewed beans, coffee so dark it looked like oil, and on the trays passed to them, a mountain, at least by their standards. Scrambled eggs, thick as bricks, toast, buttered to the crusts. Potatoes that steamed in chunks, not rations, not discipline, a feast. One woman stared at her plate like it might explode. Another nudged a slice of bacon with her fork, watching the grease bead and run like sweat. A few leaned in and whispered sharp warnings. This is how they soften you. They want you to beg. No one laughed. Most didn't speak. They moved down the line in silence, trays trembling in their hands, eyes downcast, shoulders rigid. They sat together at a table near the edge of the room, away from the noise, away from the cowboys who didn't seem to notice them. For a long moment, no one lifted a fork. The food sat hot and undisturbed. One woman reached for her toast, then froze. Another finally took a bite of egg and gagged almost instantly. Her face twisted. She clutched her stomach and pushed the tray away. Her body, so long deprived of oil and salt, revolted. Then it happened. One of the younger women, barely 20, slid from her bench to the floor with a soft thud. She didn't cry out. Her eyes fluttered. Her limbs went limp. The tray clattered beside her, potatoes scattered like coins. For a split second, no one moved. Time seemed to stop. Then a cowboy near the serving station stood, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and dropped to his knees beside her. No rifle, no barking orders, just hands, steady, strong, and surprisingly gentle. He lifted her off the floor like she weighed nothing, carried her, bridal style, past the gawking tables, her limp arms dangling. The women at her table froze, not from fear of punishment, but from something stranger. They had no frame for this. A guard was supposed to yell. A captor was supposed to sneer. Instead, the man murmured something they couldn't understand. and brushed her hair back from her face as he carried her out. No one touched their plates after that. The silence around the table was unbearable. One woman's hands shook. Another covered her mouth and stared at the door the cowboy had vanished through. Slowly, shame began to creep in, thick and unspoken. Not for the girl who fainted, but for themselves, for scoffing, for judging the food, for assuming the worst. When the cowboy returned, he didn't look at them. He just walked back to his tray, sat down, and resumed eating, as if it were nothing, as if carrying a girl like a daughter wasn't something extraordinary. But it was, and they knew it, because the plates before them weren't traps. The food wasn't a weapon, and the enemy might not be the monster they had been taught to fear. And that, somehow, was harder to digest than the food itself. By the third day, the smell no longer startled them. It still made their stomachs twist, but it didn't feel like a violation anymore. Just something that came with morning, like sun through the slats of the barracks or the groan of boots in the dirt. Bacon, beans, coffee strong enough to make your eyes water. The trays came down the line the same way every day, steady, overflowing, routine. The women no longer flinched at the sight, but most still hesitated. Their bodies remembered how to refuse, even when their minds had begun to question why. One woman began eating in secret. Not much, just a few bites of eggs. Another, older, dipped her spoon into the beans, pretending to only stir, then brought the tip to her lips when she thought no one was watching. The act was small, but it meant something. It meant the walls were cracking. They didn't talk about it, not out loud, but they were all doing the same math in their heads. How much pride can one swallow before it disappears? How many meals can you accept from a supposed enemy before you stop thinking of them that way? It wasn't just the quantity that confounded them, it was the care. The cornbread, for example, golden, crisp on the edges, warm inside. It came wrapped in cloth napkins, like it was meant to be protected. One woman picked hers up, turned it over in her hands, and finally whispered, "What is this?" A cowboy nearby overheard. He looked up from his tray, swallowed a bite, and answered simply, "Cornbread," as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. The contrast was brutal. In Japan, meals had become acts of disappearance. Quiet, rationed, watched. A bowl of watery rice, eaten in silence. A crust of bread shared between three. Food wasn't about fullness, it was about endurance. Here, meals were something else entirely. No one watched them eat. No one tracked their bites. The cowboys served the food and then walked away, as if their job ended at the ladle. That was the hardest part to understand. The absence of expectation. No speeches, no sermons, no demands to smile, to say thank you, to prove worthiness. They were fed like any man on the ranch. No more, no less. It made the food taste heavier. Not in the stomach, but in the heart. One afternoon, a tray was delivered with extra cornbread on top. No explanation. The woman who received it blinked, unsure if it was a mistake. The guard just nodded and moved on. Later, she split the piece in half and offered it to the girl who had fainted earlier in the week. The girl took it with both hands, bowed her head slightly, and bit down as if biting through her own doubt. The meals were reshaping them, not in muscle or fat, though their cheeks were less hollow now, but in memory. Each bite began to rewrite something, not erase, but question. If this is what the enemy gives without being asked, what does it mean about those who never gave at all? The cowboys didn't seem to notice the shift. Or maybe they did, and just didn't press it. They served, sat, ate, and went about their business with the same casual rhythm. One of them, older, with a limp and a slow smile, tipped his hat at the women one morning before breakfast. Not mockingly, just out of habit. She didn't know what to do, so she nodded back. It was the first acknowledgement, not of war or surrender, just two humans sharing mourning. By the end of the week, more of the trays came back empty. Some still scoffed. Some still waited until no one was looking. But the message had been sent, and it didn't need translation. The enemy wasn't starving them. The enemy was feeding them. And meat, it turned out, could say more than any manifesto. And then one morning, they asked if the women wanted to help. The question came from a sergeant with a crooked nose and a soft drawl. He didn't bark it. He offered it like someone might offer a second cup of coffee. A translator stood by to explain, her tone unsure, like even she couldn't believe what she was saying. They want volunteers. In the kitchen. For a moment, the women thought it might be a trap. Forced labor disguised as a choice. Back in Japan, volunteering was just a word for obedience dressed in softer clothing. But here, no one insisted. No names were taken. The sergeant simply nodded and walked away. The next day, two women stepped forward, then a third, quietly, cautiously. No threats, just curiosity. And maybe, under that, a desire to do something other than wait. The mess tent looked different from behind the counter. Steam rose from massive pots. Cast iron pans sizzled over open flames. The kitchen was alive in a way that barracks never were. The American cooks didn't leer or command. They grunted greetings, pointed to stations, handed over aprons. It was work, yes, but ordinary work. Not punishment, not spectacle. One cowboy showed how to stir beans slowly, to keep them from sticking. Another demonstrated how to flip bacon without snapping the grease. Soon the Japanese women were kneading dough, their hands sinking into warm yeast they had never touched before. One asked what it was. The cook held up a packet and said, "Magic powder," with a grin. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the smile. It wasn't mocking. It was shared. They learned quickly, not just the steps, but the rhythm. American kitchens, it turned out, were loud, not chaotic, but conversational. The cowboys told stories while they worked about horses, about dust storms, about a man who'd once been kicked by a mule and lived to talk about it. The women didn't understand the words, but they listened anyway. They laughed at the tones, the gestures, laughed when laughter felt safe. And then came the moment that shook them more than all the rest. It was breakfast. The line had formed. The trays were ready. Before the doors opened, the cowboys gathered near the far table, heads bowed. One spoke softly, a few words, then silence. The Japanese women froze mid-step. Were they praying? Over food? In Japan, food was rationed, not blessed. There was no ritual, only calculation. Here, the cowboys treated meals with a kind of reverence, not as proof of power, but as something fragile, something given. The women watched as one cowboy removed his hat before sitting. Another passed a slice of bread to a younger man before taking his own. No one elbowed for more. No one guarded their plate like a prize. And when the food was served, the cowboys looked up and nodded to the women behind the counter, not as servants, but as equals, as if saying, "You fed us today. Thank you." That broke something. One woman, one who had once sworn never to speak to an American, looked down at her apron, flecked with flour and grease, and touched it like it was a medal. It was stained, but it was hers. She had made something. She had given something. Not just taken. Later that afternoon she sat beneath the shade of the barracks, writing something in the dirt with her finger. Cornbread. She sounded the syllables quietly, testing them. Not to please. Not to perform. Just to remember. Because in that kitchen, With a spoon in her hand and no rifle pointed at her back, she had tasted something far more dangerous than stew. She had tasted trust, and then came the bell. It clanged through the compound each evening with a metallic echo that should have triggered flinches. In wartime Japan, bells were warnings, alerts, drills, signals to duck, run, obey. But here, the sound was slower, rounder, less urgent. It came at the same time every evening, floating over the dry Texas wind like a voice that said, "It's time! Come, if you're hungry!" That was the difference. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. At first, the women lined up with eyes low, backs stiff. Some still glanced around as if waiting for an ambush of correction. But the guards didn't bark. The cowboys didn't shove. The doors swung open, and the smell greeted them like a friend who never asked questions. The food was always there, hot, plentiful, unchanged. Routine became rhythm, and rhythm became relief. There was something strange about knowing the stew would always come, about knowing the bread would still be warm. It softened a part of them that had been tense so long it had forgotten how to be anything else. The ritual of the meal tray, line, plate, seat became an emotional anchor, a signal that, despite everything, they were still alive. And being alive didn't always have to hurt. But it wasn't just the food, it was the how of the food. One evening, a young woman with a fever didn't make it to the mess hall. She stayed, curled in her cot, head spinning, stomach clenched. No one expected anything. Illness was weakness, and weakness was usually ignored, until it wasn't. Near dusk, a knock came on the barracks door. A cowboy stood there tall, sunburned, with a tin plate in his hand. Bacon, a slice of bread. Some of that cornbread the others had started whispering about. He didn't say much, just pointed, then set the plate down gently by her cot, hat pressed to his chest like he was standing in a chapel. Then he left. The girl didn't eat for another hour. She stared at the plate as if it might explode. But eventually, she reached for the bread, broke off a piece, and held it in her palm. Warmth, on purpose. For her, word spread quietly. No one turned it into a story. No one dared label it kindness. But something shifted. The women began to look at the bell differently, not as a signal of control, but as a gesture of continuity. A cowboy somewhere had rung that bell because he believed they deserved dinner, every day, whether they hated him or not. And what do you do with a man who feeds you, without asking for anything in return? The silence among the women changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something closer to reflection. They still ate in near quiet, but now it was layered with thought, not terror. The chewing slowed. Eyes wandered not to the exits, but to each other. One woman began folding napkins at the end of each meal. Another started wiping the tables with the heel of her hand, instinctively, without instruction. Not obedience, not performance, just participation. Suspicion didn't vanish. It faded, like smoke after rain. It wasn't forced out, it just stopped making sense. No one who meant harm served stew like that, or brought seconds, or remembered that the small girl in the back liked her bread toasted on one side. So, when the bell rang now, they came. Not because they had to, but because, somehow, they wanted to. The pencils arrived without ceremony. A small box placed on a table near the mess tent. Alongside it, a stack of thin paper, rough at the edges, slightly yellowed. The announcement came quietly, almost as an afterthought. The women were allowed to write home. No conditions, no speeches, just a simple explanation through the translator, 1 letter per week. Short, plain, Nothing about military matters. For a long moment, no one moved. Writing home had always been a fantasy. In Japan, letters from the front were censored, delayed, sometimes rewritten entirely. Many of the women hadn't written to their families in months. Some believed their parents were dead. Others feared that writing at all would invite punishment or shame. A letter was not just words, it was exposure. One woman finally stepped forward. She took a pencil like it might dissolve in her fingers, sat at the table, stared at the blank page. What do you say when the truth sounds like betrayal? She thought of her mother, who used to boil rice until it split just to make it seem like more. Of her younger brother, who had learned to sleep through hunger by pressing his stomach against the floor. And now here she was, sitting in Texas, with the smell of coffee drifting through the air, and the memory of cornbread still warm on her tongue. Her hand shook as she wrote, "They feed us more than we fed ourselves." She stopped there, stared at the sentence, read it again. It felt obscene, ungrateful, true. Another woman wrote slower, choosing each word like it might be judged by history itself. "I still don't understand their kindness," she wrote. "It frightens me more than cruelty." She pressed the pencil so hard the tip snapped, then continued anyway. The letters were folded carefully. Some were kissed before being sealed. Others were left open on the table for hours, the writers unable to decide whether to finish them or tear them apart. A few women never wrote at all. They sat nearby, listening to the scratch of graphite, breathing in the smell of coffee and stew, wondering if silence was safer. The letters were collected at dusk. They traveled across the ocean with the efficiency of the system that governed them. Sorted, logged, read. And when they reached Tokyo, they did not land gently. Censors expected bitterness, complaints, confessions of suffering that could be shaped into warnings. What they found instead were quiet contradictions, calm handwriting, descriptions of food, of warmth, of dignity. Words like fed, clean, treated kindly. One official circled a sentence in red ink, then circled it again. Another read the same line 3 times, as if the meaning might change if stared at long enough. They feed us every day. That was not supposed to happen. Meetings were called behind closed doors. The letters were spread across long tables like evidence of a crime no one wanted to name. If these accounts were true, then the narrative collapsed. The Americans were not behaving like monsters. Worse, they were behaving like hosts. One official whispered, "If this spreads," and did not finish the sentence, because hunger had always been leverage. Fear had always been leverage. And now, here were women, Japanese women, describing a life in captivity that did not align with the story the nation had been told. The danger was not military, it was moral. Back in Texas, the women waited. They did not know their letters were being read by men who frowned at kindness. They only knew that something inside them had shifted the moment they wrote the truth. Putting it on paper made it real, made it undeniable. One woman folded her letter and slid it beneath her blanket. She did not send it. Not yet. But she read it again that night by the dim light of the barracks, whispering the words to herself. "They treat us like people." The sentence felt heavy, liberating, terrifying. The coffee smell lingered in the mornings now, not just in the mess hall, but in memory. It reminded them of the pencils, of the quiet courage it took to write something honest, of the fact that truth, once written, could travel farther than fear ever had. And somewhere, far away, that truth was unsettling powerful men without a single shot fired. It happened on a Tuesday, just after the noon bell rang. The line was long, the air thick with the smell of beans, grease, and something fried. The women moved forward in a familiar rhythm, now measured, calm, expectant. It was a routine, and routines made the world feel safer, but no one expected what happened next. She was short, with hands still trembling from a lifetime of rationing. Her name was Aiko, and she had never spoken above a whisper in camp. That day, she stepped forward with her tray, accepted the spoonful of stew, and then paused. "Can I have more?" she asked. The mess hall went still. The cowboy behind the ladle, a man named Roy, blinked once. His mustache twitched, and then he smiled, a broad, unmistakably human smile. "Of course, ma'am," he said, like she'd asked for the time. He scooped another generous helping onto her plate, winked, and nodded her along. And then something remarkable happened. A few women laughed. Not harshly, not with cruelty. It wasn't even directed at Aiko. It was a laugh of disbelief, of nerves fraying loose at the edges, of something soft pushing through where shame once lived. A laugh that said, "Did that really just happen?" Aiko sat down slowly. The second helping steamed in front of her. She stared at it like it might vanish if she blinked. Then she ate, and something broke. Not in a tragic way, not a collapse, but a loosening, like stitches being pulled from too tight seams. For days, they had held themselves together through posture, silence, restraint. They had followed unspoken rules of captivity. Don't eat too fast. Don't ask questions. Don't show need. Hunger was fine. Hunger was safe. But now, one of them had asked, and been answered with kindness. Not suspicion, not rebuke, just food. Around her, women began to shift in their seats. Some smiled. Some glanced at the serving line with new curiosity. A few seconds later, another asked for more bread, then another for butter. And each time, the cowboys obliged, calm as ever. Later that night, a few of the women sat together in the corner of the barracks and laughed again. They laughed softly, like it might be stolen from them if they laughed too hard. But it came. And with it came something else, ease. The kind of ease that doesn't erase pain, but gives it room to breathe. That sound laughter was the most dangerous of all. Not to the camp, not to the cowboys, but to the myths they carried. Laughter wasn't survival. It wasn't strategy. It was joy. And joy had no place in the narrative they'd been raised on. Aiko became a quiet legend. Not because she was brave, not because she gave speeches, but because she had asked for seconds. And in doing so, she had revealed that fear could be questioned. That comfort didn't always mean surrender. That perhaps they were not betraying Japan by accepting a second spoonful of stew. In the following days, the mess line grew noisier. Not rowdy, just real. Questions were asked. "What's that? Is that sweet? Do Americans eat this every day?" No one had all the answers. But the cowboys didn't seem to mind. They explained what gravy was. They grinned when someone mispronounced grits. They served without smirking. And the women, piece by piece, started letting go. Of the idea that dignity lived in starvation. Of the belief that to accept food was to lose honor. Of the voice in their heads that whispered, "You are still the enemy." Because hunger was no longer punishment. It was just appetite. And satisfaction no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like truth. If this story speaks to you, please like the video and comment below with where you're watching from. We love hearing your thoughts. The first recipe was scrawled on the back of a potato sack. One of the cowboys, grizzled and sun-dark, leaned over the mess counter and whispered something about cornstarch and bacon drippings. His name was Boone, and though he didn't say much, he had a quiet way of teaching. That day, he showed one of the women, Keiko, how to make gravy. Not just how to stir it, but how to feel when it was done. "You'll know by the sound," he said, tapping the pan. "When it sings back to you." Keiko didn't answer right away, but she watched, and then she asked. She asked what seasoning he used. She asked why the flour came first. She asked if the color mattered. And Boone, slow and patient, told her everything, not because she was a prisoner, not because he had to, but because she asked with genuine curiosity, and because he respected that. Word spread fast. Soon, others gathered by the edge of the cooking station. The guards didn't interfere. They watched from a distance, arms crossed but smiling faintly. Before long, recipe swapping became part of the rhythm. The POWs didn't just eat, they listened, tasted, compared. Some started writing notes, scraps tucked between pages of worn books or hidden inside folded sleeves, as if these simple instructions, how to make buttermilk biscuits, how long to boil beans, were pieces of a new language they were just beginning to learn. One woman, Sachiko, began collecting the recipes in a small notebook she kept under her pillow. Each entry was written with reverence. Chili, Texas style, she titled one. Cowboy cornbread, another. But it wasn't just ingredients she recorded, it was moments. She scribbled down details like, "He smiled when I got the salt right," or "said my stew was better than his sister's." These weren't just meals, they were exchanges, bridges, proof that even across war and language, some things could still be shared. There was something deeply dignified in it all. Cooking was no longer about survival, it was about participation. The act of preparing food, once a chore of desperation, became a kind of communion. They were allowed to experiment, to fail and try again, to stir and taste and offer something back. And when the Cowboys accepted a plate with a nod or returned for more, it meant everything. A shift had occurred. The mess tent, once divided by silence and suspicion, began to blur at the edges. Meal times felt different, not forced, not merely scheduled, but chosen. There were smiles traded across ladles, jokes about spice, compliments some awkward, some earnest, crossing the invisible lines between prisoner and guard. There was one day, mid-afternoon, when two women invited Boone to sit with them after serving, just for a few minutes, just to eat the stew they'd prepared under his guidance. He looked surprised, then honored. He sat. They passed him a plate, watched him eat, waited for his verdict. He finished quietly, wiped his mouth, and said, "Tastes like home." No one spoke for a moment. Not because they were confused, but because they knew exactly what that meant. And they didn't know what to do with how much it meant. Food had become something else. A message, yes, but more than that, an offering. A shared language neither side had words for, but both sides understood. With every recipe passed down, with every spoon lifted across lines once drawn in blood, something healed. Not completely, not perfectly, but undeniably. It was no longer a question of what they were fed. It was what they could make, together. The table had changed. Not in shape, not in size, but in meaning. It no longer seated enemies. It seated people, hungry, curious, and slowly grateful. The morning of departure arrived without warning. The air was cooler than usual, as if the Texas sky itself understood the weight of the moment. A truck idled near the barracks, its engine humming low and steady. No bugle, no barking orders. Just a quiet rustle of boots, the soft creak of wooden bunks, and the hushed packing of meager belongings. The women emerged one by one, faces no longer gaunt, eyes no longer guarded, not jubilant but changed, changed in ways no one would ever fully understand back home. No one was ordered to line up. They did it anyway, out of habit, or maybe out of quiet respect. Cowboys leaned against fences and mess hall doorframes, arms crossed, hats shading their eyes. There were no speeches, no fanfare, just nods. Just the kind of silence that means something, the kind that holds back more words than it releases. One woman, Miyako, held something close to her chest. A folded piece of paper, worn soft from handling. Inside was Boone's gravy recipe, scribbled in English she barely understood but had memorized by heart. She slipped it into her blouse pocket, over her heart, like it was sacred. She just bowed, low and slow, holding the gesture longer than necessary. One of the cowboys, the one who used to whistle while peeling potatoes, touched the brim of his hat in return. "They fed us like we mattered," Yuki whispered. Not to anyone in particular, but perhaps to the dry wind, or the dirt beneath her feet, or to the memory she was about to carry across the ocean. No one laughed anymore. As the truck pulled away, the dust curled in the air behind them like the pages of a book being closed. But the story didn't end there, because what had changed wasn't just location, it was understanding. These women had arrived convinced that to eat was to surrender, that kindness was a trap, that dignity came only through discipline and suffering. But they left, having tasted a different truth. The meals they had shared weren't just calories, they were quiet confirmations that humanity could survive even war. Every biscuit handed to them without mockery, every plate filled with care, every moment spent learning the art of American hospitality, it all echoed one undeniable message: you are not forgotten. You are not beneath notice. You are not broken beyond repair. And perhaps most startling of all was what those meals revealed about their own past. If the so-called enemy could offer food with open hands, could treat them not as trophies or threats, but as women deserving of rest and warmth, then what had their own leaders denied them in the name of pride? That was the reckoning that followed them home. Not shouted, not scrawled across headlines, but carried deep in their marrow, in how they looked at a bowl of rice, in how they passed bread to a child, in how they remembered that strange, dusty land where cowboys taught them how to make gravy, and, in doing so, taught them something even heavier: how to receive without fear. True hospitality doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shame, doesn't posture. It just offers, quietly, steadily, without keeping score. And for women raised on scarcity and suspicion, that kind of giving was the most radical thing of all. Was this story as powerful for you as it was for us? If so, please like and comment where in the world you're watching from. We read every word,